Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, especially on such a beautiful day. We are honored that you are instead choosing to be with us. Welcome to our event Sunday at the Met, Raphael and His Legacy, which is being held in connection with the Met's exhibition, Raphael Sublime Poetry. I'm Carmen Bambach, Marica and Jan Vilcek, Curator of Drawings and Prints here at the Met. And as the organizing curator of the Met's Raphael Sublime Poetry, I want to acknowledge Morgan Stanley, who is the presenting sponsor for the exhibition, for their support. We are indebted as well to Kenneth C. Griffin and Griffin Catalysts, and Jesse and Charles Price, who provided major funding towards the exhibition. And I offer my heartfelt thanks to the many other individuals and institutional donors who've made this exhibition possible. The Met's exhibition, Raphael Sublime Poetry, will be on view until June 28. Time is really flying. Come see the exhibition in the next 5 weeks before it ends. The Met is the only venue of this exhibition because the drawings, paintings, prints, and tapestries are rare and so extremely fragile that they cannot travel to another venue. There is a total of 237 works in the exhibition, and of these, 175 works are by Raphael, 142 drawings, and 33 paintings, selected from museums, public institutions, and private collections from around the world. We are profoundly grateful to the 62 museums, institutions, and collectors who have generously lent their precious works to the Met's exhibition. Raphael has become a towering figure in the history of Western art. Raffaello di Giovanni Santi, or simply Raphael, was born in 1483 in Urbino in the eastern part of central Italy. He worked in the Marche, Umbria, and Tuscany with notable private patrons in Florence. Arriving in Rome in 1508, he rose quickly to the highest echelons of society at the courts of Popes Julius II and Leo X. He spent the last 12 years of his life in Rome, celebrated as a prince of painters, and died in 1520 at the age of 37. The Met's exhibition presents an overview of Raphael's entire career and is arranged mostly in chronological order, in which his drawings are often seen in relationship to his paintings. The show also includes 63 works by other artists, so as to situate Raphael in the context of his time and the places where he worked. I have emphasized certain key themes of his career, such as his Madonnas, his portraits, and his extremely well-organized use of workshop associates and assistants to complete numerous projects. In his remarkably prolific but very short career, Raphael excelled as a draftsman and painter, and later he also excelled as an architect, as a designer of tapestries and theatrical sets. He was a major architectural theorist and an erudite scholar of ancient Rome and its monuments. Many of Raphael's gifted associates and assistants later became important artists in their own right. I've emphasized Raphael's early paintings and drawings when he sought to establish himself as a young artist in the Marche and Umbria. Among Raphael's early works, the Met's exhibition focuses attention on his monumental ensemble, now known as the Colonna altarpiece. The Colonna altarpiece originally consisted of multiple parts and included a base or predella, which contained 5 small painted panels. But the paintings were dismantled and sold off in the 1660s and 1670s and are now dispersed in different museums. So for the first time since the 1660s, all the component paintings of the Colonna altarpiece are presented as a reunited structure, as you see in this slide. The long central panel of the predella of the Colonna altarpiece is a painting of the procession to Calvary from London's National Gallery. In case you overlook it, this detail of the London painting reveals a young Raphael's already extraordinary skill as a landscape painter. The procession to Calvary is set in a landscape with the sky seen in dimming sunlight. In the background, tiny buildings and towns appear in the bluish haze of the distant landscape. And in the middle ground at right, some castellated buildings rise amidst green hills, valleys, and a body of water. The Met's exhibition is conceived as a glimpse over the artist's shoulder so as to understand the intimacy of Raphael's creative process. Done when Raphael was 20 or so, this drawing for the foreshortened head of the Apostle James reveals his dazzling command of anatomical perspective. In 1504, the 21-year-old Raphael went to study and work in Florence, learning from the major artists there, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Fra Bartolomeo. As you see here at left, the experience of Leonardo's brainstorm sketches totally revolutionized Raphael's approach to the design process. Raphael learned to let go of the impulse to finish drawings with all their details and let his imagination run loose on the paper. At right is his full-scale design or cartoon for a painting of St. Catherine. It communicates with enormous expressive power and cultural presence, partly indebted to his experience of Michelangelo's art. In the display of Raphael's imagery of the Madonna and Child, I've presented his paintings and drawings not only in their artistic context, but I've also noted the religious significance and deeper meaning of this imagery as we consider the shocking high mortality of young women of childbearing age and the high mortality of children. Therefore, in an alcove in the exhibition, you will see Verrocchio and Ferrucci's magnificent marble relief of the death of Francesca Pitti Tornabuoni in childbirth in 1477. You will also see a vitrine which displays 2 volumes. Inside this vitrine at right is the account book containing the funeral and burial expenses for Raphael's mother, Magia Charla, who died in 1491 of childbirth complications when Raphael was 8 years old. Inside the vitrine at left is the anatomical treatise printed in Venice in 1491, illustrating the state of knowledge of a woman's reproductive organs at the time of Raphael's mother's death. The awareness of the astronomically high mortality rates of young women and children in early modern times can help us experience Raphael's imagery in a more profoundly emotive context. This awareness can also help us better understand the spiritual significance of hope for a society that was accustomed to premature deaths as we contemplate the ideal beauty and affecting humanity of Raphael's Virgin and Child. There are 142 drawings by Raphael woven into the selection of works in the exhibition, and most of these, as I would like to emphasize, are rarely seen together in exhibitions. At right is a famous sheet of drawings from the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Lille. In the exhibition, our visitors can see the Alba Madonna displayed with the preparatory studies on both sides of the paper, recto and verso. In the case of the Alba Madonna, the psychological presence of the figures emanating from their gazes is extraordinary, as is also Raphael's command of landscape. Here is a detail of the landscape at left in Raphael's Alba Madonna, and a detail of the landscape at right in Raphael's Alba Madonna. To elaborate on the question of Raphael's landscapes, which is quite neglected in the literature, despite the strong visual evidence of the masterful painting technique and style of the Vision of Ezekiel, It has seemed surprising to me that some art historians still insist in attributing this small, exquisitely painted picture to Giulio Romano rather than accept Raphael's authorship. Raphael's conceptual genius as a landscape painter is yet to be fully understood in the literature. A late painting done soon after Leonardo's theoretical writings on landscapes and the meteorological events that transformed them, the vision of Ezekiel depicts a vast landscape transformed by a miraculous weather event. It reveals Raphael's acuity in his empirical study of nature. He rendered the landscape in atmospheric perspective along a diagonal depth of space from foreground to distant background, a splendid alchemy of divine light, natural sunlight, and a storm in progress with wind and rain transforms this vast landscape as it courses from left to right in the composition. Raphael's approach to portraiture is a major theme in the exhibition, with a special emphasis on the portraits of women, and the talk by Dr. Wolk-Simon will elaborate on this. More orderly and focused as a painting than many of those by his predecessors, Raphael's so-called La Muta from Urbino offers a critical response to Leonardo in its naturalistic costume details, simplicity of composition, and chromatic harmonies. The woman's gaze communicates a powerful psychological presence. Raphael learned from Leonardo his concept of human gesture as an embodiment of the motions of the mind and motions of the soul, the moti mentali and moti dell'anima. The human mind and soul were the prime movers of the body, facial expression, and the hands, according to Leonardo and medieval Aristotelian natural philosophy. Notice the expressive force of La Muta's hands. The Met's exhibition offers our visitors an opportunity to admire famous masterpieces, such as the portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, the celebrated author of the Book of the Courtier, who was Raphael's intimate friend. In his paintings, Raphael sought to illuminate the very soul of his subjects beyond their external appearance, whether they were the sitters in his portraits or the actors in his dramatic narrative compositions. Here, the knowing gaze and the courtly beauty of Baldassare Castiglione's costume and pose, explored by Raphael with a breathtaking technical virtuosity, serve to immortalize the depth of their friendship for the ages. By bringing together a very large group of drawings by Raphael, we hope to support scholars and students in their close study of his drawings, which are an essential part of his oeuvre. To stress, even seasoned scholars do not always have easy access to Raphael's drawings in museums. Raphael produced an extraordinary variety of drawing types, and some sheets will seem astonishingly expressionistic and modern. Note here the drapery study at left. But Raphael's drawings are often studied from photographs and are often treated as images in books or as comparisons for paintings. To emphasize, photographs of drawings entirely flatten the topography of both the drawn marks and the paper. In photos, we stop seeing the evidence of the creative process on the paper in a continuum of time. We may ask, where and how does the artist start on the paper? How does he search for the poses of a figure? What does he struggle with? What does he correct? What does he omit? How does he readapt his style and technique when having to draw large drawings for frescoes with forms that need to be seen from a far viewing distance? An example is Raphael's very rare cartoon fragment for the fresco of the Disputa, which is bold and gestural with little blending of tones. Raphael's hatching in this drawing communicates almost feral energy. The exhibition also presents this fresco fragment by Raphael from the Accademia Nazionale di San Luca, with my new proposal that it was a decorative element above a fireplace in a destroyed room in the Vatican Palace. Above this fireplace, this fresco of a puto flanked the coat of arms of Pope Julius II and had a companion puto on the other side of Julius's arms. The connoisseurship of Raphael's drawings is complex, and there are a number of questions about authorship. The possibilities of seeing a large group of drawings by Raphael in the Met's exhibition sprinkled throughout will hopefully stimulate further questions, ideas, comments about authorship, and more importantly, about the functions of drawings. The Met's exhibition presents a number of reattributions of drawings and paintings, which I have suggested based on style and technique. Of course, such conversations continue. For example, I've sought to display the monumental altarpiece of the Ecstasy of Saint Cecilia from the Pinacoteca Nazionale di Bologna, next to this drawing seen here on the left from the Petit Palais in Paris. The Paris drawing at left has usually been studied from photographs, and the attribution to Raphael has repeatedly been rejected in the literature. This drawing is discussed in the Met's exhibition as Raphael's discarded demonstration drawing or modello for the altarpiece sent from Rome, where Raphael intended to paint the altarpiece, to Bologna, to the patron Elena Duglioli dell'Olio, the Bolognese noblewoman. The enlarged details of this drawing from the Petit Palais in Paris demonstrate the technical virtuosity of the modeling with washes and gouache highlights, supporting the attribution to Raphael. There is much exploratory underdrawing in black chalk, and there are numerous changes of design, which only the creator of the composition could have envisioned. On display at the Met are 4 of Raphael's magnificent drawings from Chatsworth, which have not been seen in recent exhibitions on the great artist, and I illustrate one of these rare Chatsworth drawings. No less importantly, the study for the Apostles in the Transfiguration from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford helps us better understand why Raphael continued to be idolized as a supreme Italian Renaissance artist from about 1510 until the mid to late 19th century. But the history of changing tastes has also greatly affected Raphael's fame during the course of 3 centuries, and eventually led to the lesser appreciation of his works in the 20th and 21st centuries. As a modern and contemporary public, we are perhaps overly comfortable with the expressive power of abstract art, and Raphael's paintings may seem often too perfect in their technical virtuosity, too easily graceful and harmonious in their compositions and use of color. But to look only at Raphael's paintings is far from sufficient. The full arduous journey of his creativity is manifested in his drawings. The numbers, varieties, and types of his drawings communicate his thinking on paper with a breathtaking immediacy. They vividly demonstrate how he studiously and patiently experimented on paper with a tremendous creative force. The journey through Raphael's drawings allows us to say that the almost preternatural perfection and harmonies in Raphael's paintings were the result of a very hard-won victory. The 3 talks that you will hear today will explore 3 important aspects of Raphael's work and his legacy: his celebrated fresco paintings in the stanze of the Vatican Palace, his portraits, and Raphael's legacy to 19th century French artists. It is my pleasure to introduce now Professor Arnold Nasselrath, who is co-director of the Antiquitatum Thesaurus at the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy. Professor Nasselrath has published widely on the classical tradition and on Italian Renaissance art and architecture. His scholarship has focused on Raphael's drawings, easel and fresco paintings, architectural design, and Raphael's study of antiquity. We may single out his monographs on the Fossombrone sketchbook, Raphael's School of Athens, the 15th century frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, Raphael and Pinturicchio, and his Raphael exclamation mark, published in 2020 to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Raphael's death. For many years, he directed the census of antique works of art and architecture known in the Renaissance at the Warburg Institute in London and Humboldt Universität in Berlin. He worked at the Vatican Museums for several decades, and from 1995 to 2017, he was director of the Department of Byzantine, Medieval, and Modern Art of the Vatican Museums. In this role, he oversaw the major conservation campaigns and cleaning of Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican Palace. And concurrently, from 1996 to 2019, he held the prestigious chair as professor of early modern and modern art history at the Humboldt Universität in Berlin. Please join me in welcoming Professor Arnold Nasselrath to the stage.
Thank you, Carmen, Mariana, and Gabriel, for getting me back to this wonderful stage after 37 years. As you've just heard, that's the time in which Raphael created all his works. This return awakens memories of dear friends, great scholars, outstanding restorers, and the dawn of a discovering unexplored evidence in the physical condition of Raphael's Stanze. Back in 1989, we were still in the early stages of a restoration campaign in the Pope's staterooms of the early 16th century, which Raphael painted between 1508 and 1517, and where we stayed engaged for 30 years. Currently, you have a great show dedicated to Raphael here at the Met, which besides celebrating the artist's wonderful creations, is scrutinizing this epic phase of extending the art historical evidence, the art historical discourse to the evidence provided by technical data. Invited to talk here in New York today, I wondered, what could I bring to you to this spectacular occasion? I decided that I'd take you up to a visit on the scaffoldings. You might enjoy peeping behind the curtains and catching a glimpse of what happens there, now during restorations, or then during Raphael's creation of his monumental frescoes. Oh, sorry. This is what it looks like on the scaffoldings. And now we go on. Climbing up on these scaffoldings was a challenge, an opportunity, and generated emotions which needed to be shared. I'm convinced Raphael would have approved of me living the experience also with the family, since he loved kids and his intimate depictions of children, as you can see here on the right, belong to the most empathic and sensitive ones artists ever produced. On the same level, highly official visits occurred. Now, for example, when Pope Benedict XVI himself came up on the scaffolding while we were working at the time in the Pauline Chapel. There is no reason why Pope Julius II, who took personal interest in Raphael's work, like Benedict did in ours, should not have visited Raphael in the Stanza della Segnatura, his designated private library. After all, the artist painted his allegories, stories, cycles, and decorations explicitly according to Julius's direct prescriptions. During one of such visits, on the scaffolding in front of the School of Athens, there must have been a sudden accident, like a tilting plank, sort of moving forward rapidly. 5 different people must have caught themselves instantly against the wall at the same moment, with the same movements, hitting the fresco paint because there are handprints by 5 different people along more or less the same height. I hope you can make them out. One is here, one is over there, somewhere up there, and one is down here. There's a painted hand. The artist did not attempt any repair which would have made things worse. The blotches were quite well camouflaged within the painted travertine. In fact, they were not noticed for almost 500 years. We have documented their position in our diagrams. The fingerprints can, of course, not be identified, even if one will most certainly be Raphael's. I hope you can find them. They're up there, they're up here. These are the most evident, and there are some others on the same height. It would make a wonderful story to speculate who the others might have been. It would sound romantic to have Raphael showing Julius around on the scaffolding, like Charlton Heston did with Rex Harrison in The Agony and the Ecstasy, or me with Benedict XVI in the Pauline Chapel. From close-up, we can not only admire these staggering paintings differently, but their creations really come to life. We almost get to look over the painter's shoulder and follow the restless move of his hand. His mahl stick, on which he rested his arm, and I've put the mahl stick to the left, which of course is not Raphael's, on which he rested his arm to avoid smudging the paint he had already applied, has left hundreds of little imprints in the plaster. You can make them out in front of the nose of Socrates. From their accumulation, you can grasp the speed of his brushstrokes like a life action. You can make out that Raphael had prepared a cartoon also for the architectural setting of the School of Athens. It is evident from the tiny little dots of the cartoon transfer, and here you can see quite a number of them, and the straight lines incised directly into the plaster on top of the dots. These are the incisions, and over there you can see them quite well, actually, with these wonderful screens. It is clearly in a clearly calculated organization, he transferred his huge drawing in scale, i.e. 1:1, or 8.2 meters by 5.2 meters, with the so-called spolvero or pricking technique in daily chunks to the wall. The upper half of this cartoon is lost today. While the painter Parmigianino came to Rome in 1524, he still saw and copied the entire cartoon. The bottom one is the Parmigianino drawing, and the top one is the cartoon again. At this point, I should like to remind you in a brief parenthesis that Raphael was one of the greatest, most versatile Renaissance architects. We therefore entitled our Raphael exhibition in Vicenza 3 years ago, The Born Architect. He almost started his Roman career, in fact, in this dual capacity. In the year after he painted the School of Athens in 1510-11, he built the loggia on the banks of Rome's river Tiber in the garden of the new villa of the banker Agostino Chigi, perhaps Raphael's wealthiest patron ever. And what I'm showing you here is the villa on the banks of the River Tiber with, of course, no lodger there anymore. Nothing, alas, of Chigi's Tiber lodger survived. Nobody knows anymore what it looked like. The fate of almost all of Raphael's buildings causes his architectural competence and career essential for grasping his multifaceted creativity to be frequently neglected, and the exhibition here is quite an exception to this. But let us get back to our scaffoldings and the day-to-day life there, from which these great works have arisen. We even know what the workmen ate, maybe even Raphael himself. The people who applied the plaster to the wall surface for him in the summer of 1514 ate beans. Namely, in a weak spot in the fire in the Borgo, we found baked beans underneath a fully pristine painted surface. These beans here on the right come out this part of the fresco. Columbus had brought these vegetables back to Europe from the New World, and in just over a decade, it became basic food for the workers. The encounter between Pope Leo the Great and Attila the Hun is the first fresco painted in 1513 after the death of Pope Julius II and right after the election of Leo X, Raphael's new papal patron. Raking light reveals an indirect incision around the papal portrait, around the portrait heads of the two cardinals riding their mules and accompanying the pontiff on his white palfrey. And if you look carefully, you can see the incised lines there and the biretta up there, and here it's a bit more difficult to make out. For Cardinal Sigismondo Gonzaga, which is the drawing on the right, fortunately the colored pastel drawing survives, which Raphael had produced to transfer his likeness into the scenery. When the artist visited him at home or in his office for a rapid sketch, Gonzaga wore his simple biretta, which had to be changed in the fresco into the broad cardinal's hat, according to the protocol for the occasion depicted. There are well over 50 such portraits from the papal court all over the stanza, easily recognizable by their intense gaze. Raphael, and it had almost certainly to be the master himself, must have visited every single one of them, of these people, of all ranks, from the groom up to the pope, including even the papal destrier, which you can see down here. Raphael acquired the individual likenesses of these people rapidly and used them across all the wall paintings were established together with a patron. With some of them, the artist enjoyed a close friendship. Others he had to attend upon officially. Some people Raphael could not possibly meet, like the French King Francis I. He had to rely on a medal, and he's up there. There, he had to rely on a medal. Himself, he knew well for his self-portraits, down here and up there. Some must have fascinated him, like Cardinal Raffaele Riario, whose vivid eye almost reflects the forceful but infelicitous personality. For the papal likenesses, he apparently had to go economically, even if Julius appears 4 times, of which once posthumously. And I won't go into analyzing the relationship of the various portraits you're seeing on the screen, including the drawing in the middle of them. For the papal chair bearers are particularly buoyant folks, with their divergent characters who might have arrived from quite different origins. They are wearing their vibrant velvet dresses, mostly without headgear, and they show off their individual haircuts and hair colors, fair and black, curled and straight, and their beard shapes, short, mustached, and even clean-shaven. Just two are wearing caps, one of whom also served as groom, or maybe he changed job under the new pontiff, as you can see here from these two likenesses. You will have noticed the paucity of women in the frescoes in the stanza. There are no female portraits for obvious historical reasons, but there are still very beautiful ideal female protagonists, like the ones witnessing the miracle in Bolsena. They're dominating the left part of the scenery with their emphatic gestures, or they're attending the Mass reclining gracefully on the ground in their flowing robes and with their elegant hairstyles. The women have brought several sweet young children, even a baby. Some are cuddling each other. They're the ones that establish contact with the onlooker by directly looking out to them. Thus, Raphael manages, almost unnoticed, to involve the people in the room gently with them and through them, with the action in the fresco. Especially in the stanza di Eliodoro, the people in the room are to be conducted to the sensation that they themselves are the culmination of the historic cycle which they're told on the walls around them. The patience and power wrenched by Raphael and his papal patrons are sensed all over the scaffoldings in the stanza when you notice small or important pentimenti, i.e. fixes. The tension between these two poles is an integral part of almost every creation in these rooms. Once again, Leo and Attila is a wide-ranging example. When Leo X was elected, Raphael was approaching his last fresco in the room, for which Julius had still approved the composition. While he had wanted to appear as a protagonist, carried in his sedia gestatoria, top left, Leo decided to alter the theological message and to withdraw completely to the background, top right. Raphael had to tear off the group in the left foreground and invent a new setting. But the final version had not been reached yet, and the iconography and the composition had to be changed once again. The throne of Julius was, however, not thrown away, but Julius paid homage to his predecessor by ordering Raphael to cut down the left foreground in the expulsion of Heliodorus and had Raphael insert his invention in this corner on the opposite wall. One can tell the story of the stanza in many different versions, bringing out Raphael's infinite energy, passion, and patience. Up on the scaffolding, you can also meet the experimental Raphael, not only inventing pictures to convey the Pope messages. They were not painted for eternity. Instead, Raphael could expect them to be destroyed by the next pontiff, as he was destroying the works of the previous generation, and already, as we have seen, at least partly his own. With such prospect, he enjoyed himself in never-ending experiments, always curious to try out something new, full of spontaneous inventions and to achieve special effects. As soon as he had understood or conquered a challenge, he tried something else. This applies also to other media and techniques he invested in, like tapestries, prints, stucco, sculpture, architecture, and much more. Again, just one example for the liberation of St. Peter's. To render the darkness of the night, Raphael has veiled the entire scene with a thin layer of azurite fresco. He's trying to transfer a glazing technique from oil to fresco painting. Applying, however, colors wet on wet in fresco painting will easily result in smudging colors. But Raphael has developed a sensibility in fresco technique which had been considered impossible. He shows the infinite array of different lights from all sources he can imagine. The flickering torches, the shining moon, a breaking dawn, and the divine light. All of them reflecting additionally on different surfaces and their shadows as dynamic interactions of the light. His virtuosity enabled him to recover the face of the angel, which had been hid inadvertently with a red brush. You can once more invent an inspired episode from the workshop, a discussion, a fight, or a slip joke. While the paint immediately started running along the plaster, he spontaneously wiped off the drop with his finger and adjusted the damage. Under infrared light, the layers of color and the sequence of events still become evident, and the sensitive state of conservation could be studied before treating the area of the painting. Sublime Madonnas are not Raphael's hallmark. His way of painting is dynamic. Just look at the verve of the chair bearer's hilt and the intuition to get reflections and volume right. He's meticulous and at the same time spontaneous. Look at the tassel of the sedia gestatoria in the Mass of Bolsena and the distinction from the metal fittings. He's impressionistic. Just look at the fluid candles in the in contrast with the firm relief of the glowing flames and the repulsion of Hierodorus. On the scaffolding, you realize Raphael's creativity in art and architecture cannot merely be seen, contemplated, studied, but it reveals itself also when it's stroked. Under raking light, the head of the so-called Calliope from Parnassus discloses a lively surface, a universe of brushstrokes, joints, layers, cracks, and much more. The scaffoldings in the stanza have long gone, and what we've seen or noticed, we have tried to share in many illustrated publications. The aim of publications is not to foster blockbusters or mass tourism, but to stimulate a genuine sensitivity for aesthetic qualities in everyday life, in every environment, and to appreciate them. As we're here in New York, and as we are looking at Raphael's mobile creations, I should like once more to pay tribute and refer you to Picasso's Gertrude Stein, the first cubist portrait ever painted. In 1917, the great British art critic Roger Fry compared it with Raphael's likeness of a pregnant young woman, La Gravida, pointing to, quote, the similarity of their solutions. Taking no historical circumstances into account, only the, quote, aesthetic feeling. Picasso considered this juxtaposition as his ultimate breakthrough after more than 100 years, since he had painted this work. He was apparently pleased that Fry had evoked Raphael himself to finally lead the public up to his own art. When the works by Raphael from far away will have gone back home, the few that remain can, in concert with Gertrude, foster these vital aesthetic feelings. Gertrude will stay with you here. You could get close to her surface and reenact the energy launched by Raphael to look beyond Raphael, Picasso, and the world of today. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was incredible, Arnold. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Linda Wolk-Simon, an admired specialist of 16th century Italian art. Professor Wolk-Simon was a longtime curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was also my colleague in the Met's Department of Drawings and Prints. She was head of the drawings department at the Morgan Library and Museum and director of the Fairfield University Art Museums. She has organized exhibitions at the Met, the Morgan, and Fairfield, and in other locations, and she has also been teaching at the New York University for several years. Professor Wolk-Simon has written extensively on Raphael and artists in his circle, especially Giulio Romano and Perino del Vaga, and is currently preparing a book on Raphael's workshop. She has authored the award-winning catalog on Raphael's Colonna altarpiece at the Metropolitan, which accompanied her exhibition at the Met in 2006. Please join me in welcoming Professor Linda Wolk-Simon to the stage.
Thank you, Carmen, for the invitation to speak today, and congratulations on this really epic and memorable exhibition. And I wish I didn't have to follow Arnold. It seems so unfair. We're going from the macrocosm to the very microcosm, because today I'm going to talk to you about a single painting in the exhibition. Raphael's fetching portrait of a young woman with a unicorn, which is a great enigma. When was it painted, and for what reason? Why does the sitter hold a unicorn, and who does it represent? There are no documents that might clarify these questions, and the portrait isn't mentioned in any early sources. I should also say that the Raphael attribution was only proposed in the early 20th century, and not all experts concurred. So the portrait is, indeed, an enigma wrapped in a mystery. Just the kind of mystery art historians, who are sleuths at heart, love. This might seem like a cold case, but there are some clues, and these are to be found, I think, in the image itself. The work's assumed date is also relevant. Assembling the evidence, I ventured a proposal about the identity of the sitter and the reasons the portrait may have been painted, and I'll lay it out for you now. I begin with this portrait by Raphael of Maddalena Strozzi, painted around 1505-1506, because it offers an informative comparison with the portrait of a lady with the unicorn of about the same date. The two sitters are identically posed, and the formats are similar. Oops, let's come back. The model for both is the Mona Lisa. Raphael adopts Leonardo's innovative way of depicting the figure, half-length, seated, with hands crossed in her lap, angled slightly away from the picture plane and set before a distant landscape. The ambiguous setting of the Mona Lisa was at some stage meant to be read as an open loggia, as we know from a copy made in Leonardo's workshop. Raphael employs the same compositional device in the portrait of a lady with a unicorn, but not in the Maddalena Strozzi portrait. When Raphael painted Maddalena Strozzi, he was based in Florence, but we know that he went back and forth between there and Urbino no fewer than 4 times before he moved permanently to Rome in 1508. Some of the works executed during his so-called Florentine period then were done for patrons in Urbino, and we'll come back to Urbino, which I think is relevant for uncovering the story of the lady with the unicorn. Here I show you a masterful drawing by Raphael of a young woman seated in a loggia that opens onto a distant landscape. It was done at the same time as the portraits of Maddalena Strozzi and the lady with the unicorn, and has obvious affinities with both. It may be a study for one of these portraits. This has often been proposed, and for obvious reasons. Or, as some scholars believe, it may instead be a rumination on the Mona Lisa, an exercise rather than a preparatory drawing for a specific painting. I think the many resemblances to the lady with the unicorn, the sitter's pose, hairstyle, and voluminous left sleeve, and her placement between 2 columns rising from a half wall behind her, make it likely that the drawing is connected with this portrait, even if it isn't immediately obvious that they both portray the same person. The drawing presents a paradox. It both adheres to and departs from the mimetic properties of portraiture, which had as its imperative the transcription of recognizable reality. The Renaissance polymath Leon Battista Alberti famously praised portraiture's uncanny ability to conjure or make present those who were absent, a kind of magic realism that depended on verisimilitude and truthfulness. If it didn't look like the person it's purported to represent, it didn't have that sort of conjuring agency. So we see on the one hand the meticulously described details of the woman's clothing, headdress, and setting. These persuade as being observed from life. But that seems to be less the case with her prettified, slightly veiled features, hence the view that this isn't a portrait at all of a real person, but rather Raphael doing Leonardo. The physiognomy, the face, of course, is the signal province of portraiture. The physiognomy is idealized and formulaic rather than descriptive and specific. And unlike the portrait of Maddalena or her husband or the beautiful portrait of Castiglione that we've seen, done some 10 years later, this doesn't quite fully persuade as an actual likeness of a specific person, someone you would recognize if she walked by. This dichotomy between real and ideal can be reconciled, I think, if the drawing portrays a sitter whose actual appearance was unknown to the artist firsthand. In other words, I think it could be a kind of generic template for a portrayal that could be particularized in a painted iteration. Our portrait moves in that direction, but the striking blonde hair, very unusual in Raphael's portraits, and the blue eyes, and the regular features still seem somewhat generalized. And I think something to consider is that the portrait may have been based on a written description, which was not an unheard of practice. Perhaps the specifics lie not in the sitter's pleasing but oddly nondescript appearance, but in the setting and the landscape background, in external attributes, that is, that signal a specific locus, and by extension, some connection of this invention, this sitter, to that place. The cluster of buildings in the right background, which includes a tall bell tower with a distinctive conical tapering spire, appears, I think, to represent San Francesco in Urbino, one of the city's principal churches. Raphael's father was buried here. This is a specific and localized architectural reference. And like the small church in the background of Raphael's beautiful Madonna and Child of about the same date, I believe it carries a reference to Urbino. The church in the background of the Madonna is this church of San Bernardino, not a literal transcription, but meant to be recognized as this structure. A further allusion to Urbino is perhaps to be found in the columns flanking the seated woman, a suggestive evocation of the graceful arcades, colonnades, and balconies of the ducal palace. These all carry over to the painted portrait, and I sort of like to imagine her sitting somewhere in that loggia where I put that arrow. That is not a historical document. I couldn't resist this. This popped up online. Somebody felt the impulse to reenact this as a real portrait. All these allusions, I think, carry over to the painted portrait of the lady with the unicorn, where this framing device and the entire compositional scheme recur. In the prominent bell tower, the prominent bell tower that we see in the drawing becomes a very distant structure in the background of the portrait. These visual references suggest that Raphael's portrait of a lady with a unicorn were produced during that time, that he was largely based in Florence, and adhering to a new idiom of female portraiture inspired by Leonardo da Vinci, was commissioned by someone connected to Urbino rather than Florence, perhaps during one of the artist's documented visits there in the years in question. Sorry. A little ahead of ourselves. And to this point, it's not a coincidence that the Madonna and Child on the screen again in the center, most certainly done for Urbino, employs the same half wall behind the figure, a pictorial device that we don't see in any other painting by Raphael and is perhaps possibly another evocative Urbino reference. If you go there today, the streets of this beautiful hill town are lined with these half walls. The essential question of the unknown sitter's identity persists, but now with a more specific inflection. Was there a young woman with some connection to Urbino, resident or not, whose portrait Raphael would have had occasion to paint in the years 1505 or 1506, and for whom a dog, the animal that the sitter originally held, as we know from x-rays, a dog and or a unicorn would have been an appropriate symbol? There's one compelling candidate whose biography and conceivably whose appearance, to the extent it can be conjectured, accords neatly with the chronology and the circumstances I've posited for the portrait of a lady with a unicorn. And her name is Laura Orsini della Rovere. Laura Orsini was the daughter of Giulia Farnese. A celebrated beauty, Giulia was the sister of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese and mistress of the notoriously worldly and nepotistic Pope Alexander VI Borgia. Almost everyone at the time believed that Laura's father was in fact the Pope himself. He had been elevated to the papacy in the year of her birth, so I guess that was the celebration, rather than Giulia's inconsequential husband, Orsino Orsini. This was a persistent and widely circulated rumor. The biographer, Giorgio Vasari, reported that the artist Pinturicchio, in fact, had painted an image of Alexander VI adoring the Madonna and Child in his papal apartments in the Vatican, and that the Madonna was actually a likeness of Giulia Farnese, and by implication, the infant was the baby Laura. Later inhabitants regarded this indecorous family portrait as downright blasphemous, so the work was removed, and since it disappeared without a trace, the story was dismissed as fake news meant to impugn the licentious Pope. That is, until fragments of the offending image were rediscovered not long ago and a copy of it identified, and it's the copy I show you here because it shows it in its entirety. If Pope Alexander VI was indeed Laura's father, his children from an earlier liaison, the infamous Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia among them, were her half-siblings. So if they were blood relations, some inkling of Laura's appearance can perhaps be gleaned from portraits of Lucrezia. These are few and dubious. We're not really sure these really represent her. So little meaningful can be extracted, but it's certain that like the woman in Raphael's portrait, Lucrezia Borgia had blonde hair, which was unusual in Italy in that day. Contemporary descriptions extol her stunning golden tresses. One smitten admirer was the unpious Cardinal Lorenzo Pucci, who exalted of how her hair looked dripping wet when she combed it after the bath. And tradition holds that a lock of blonde hair preserved in a reliquary is hers. Half-siblings or not, Lucrezia Borgia and the young Laura Orsini lived together for a time in Rome with Laura's mother, Giulia Farnese, in the palace of the Pope's cousin, adjacent to the Vatican, and conveniently situated for impromptu papal visits, both conjugal and paternal. Giulia Farnese had two fortified castles not far from Rome, the Castello Orsini in Vasanello on the left, inherited from her husband upon his death in 1500, and the Rocca Farnese in Carbognano, a gift from Pope Alexander VI. The little-known interior decorations of both of these are of help in deciphering the Borghese portrait. The most prominent attribute of the unknown young woman, as we've seen, is the docile unicorn in her lap. A time-honored medieval symbol of chastity, think of the unicorn tapestries in the cloisters, this mythical beast was enlisted as a heraldic emblem of the Farnese family, seen, for instance, here in the shield emblazoned with the Farnese fleur-de-lis. This is the coat of arms of Giulia Farnese's father, and you see the unicorn above the shield. Giulia herself employed the immaculate unicorn as a personal device. an ironic or perhaps defiant choice for the unchaste Sponsa Christi, or Bride of Christ, as she was derisively anointed in Rome. In one of her castles, pairs of unicorns inhabit a circular frieze below a painted ceiling, and in the other, spirited white unicorns and blonde-haired maidens clad in flowing draperies and printed with the Farnese lilies cavort in the lunettes, while the ceiling is the domain of a regal, prancing unicorn. Allusions to the Farnese aside, unicorns in Renaissance art retained their meaning as signifiers of purity and virginity. Leonardo da Vinci recounted and drew the often repeated legend that only a virgin could subjugate a unicorn, a wild beast by nature, which, as he wrote, for the delight it has for young maidens, forgets its ferocity and wildness, and laying aside all fear, goes to sleep in her lap. As symbols of chastity, unicorns appear frequently in female portraits of the Renaissance. On the reverse of this portrait medal by Pisanello of a member of the princely Gonzaga family is an image of a maiden with a tamed unicorn. A more elaborate visualization is found on the back of Piero della Francesca's portrait of Battista Sforza, wife of the Duke of Urbino, where we see a chariot drawn by two unicorns. The subject is the Triumph of Chastity, a tableau taken from the Italian poet Petrarch, intended to announce the chaste and virtuous nature of the sitter depicted on the other side of the panel. If the young woman in the portrait is Laura Orsini, the unicorn she holds assumes a dual meaning. It's at once a conventional attribute of female virtue, like the medal and the Piero portrait, but it's also a heraldic reference to this particular sitter's Farnese lineage. That lineage was paramount in late 1505 and 1506, the exact date of Raphael's portrait, based on stylistic criteria. That date is when Laura Orsini wed the nephew of Pope Julius II, della Rovere, who we've heard about. The nuptials took place in November 1505, and the celebrations went on for months, carrying on into the year 1506. For the ascendant Farnese, the often and expediently betrothed Laura, she had been betrothed twice before she was 10. Both of those agreements had been canceled in order to pursue a more advantageous match. For the Farnese, a marriage to the Pope's nephew represented a new apogee in the family fortunes. And you see on the right her uncle, Cardinal Alessandro, the future Pope Paul III. For Julius II on the left, and by the way, Cardinal Alessandro was made a cardinal by Julius. For Julius II, architect of by the Borgia Pope, by Alexander VI. For Julius II, architect of a calculated scheme of matrimonial alliances linking him and his della Rovere relations to the oldest and most powerful of Roman families, the strategic benefits were even greater. This marriage strengthened ties with both the venerable Orsini clan, a belligerent thorn in every Renaissance pope's side, and the increasingly powerful Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, the bride's uncle, and as I said, a future pope himself. And the marriage finally also represented a significant advance in the ascent of the parvenu, by Roman standards, della Rovere family. So it's a win-win-win, and if Laura maybe felt like a chess piece, see image below, I can understand why. The ceiling decoration of Giulia Farnese's castle that I showed a minute ago, and again here, celebrates this felicitous union between her daughter, Laura Orsini, and the Pope's nephew. The coffers are painted with alternating Orsini red roses and della Rovere oak trees, while Giulia's own pedigree is announced in the heraldic shields in the frieze displaying the colors and impaled coat of arms of the Orsini and Farnese. Given Laura's dubious parentage and Pope Julius II's deep antipathy for his predecessor Alexander VI and all things relating to the Borgia, there's one school of thought that the reason he moved upstairs and had to have all the Vatican Stanze painted was because he couldn't bear living in the apartments of Alexander VI below. Given Laura's dubious parentage, it would have been imperative that her Orsini lineage be considered unimpeachable. The decorations of Giulia Farnese's castello trumpeted this message. In one segment, the heraldic bear of the Orsini makes a rare appearance in the lower right, engaged in conversation with the Farnese unicorn before a backdrop of Della Rovere acorns, the full constellation of familial emblems. And Orsini roses abound throughout the decoration. If the young woman in Raphael's portrait is Laura Orsini, her voluminous red and white sleeves would have been understood as a heraldic reference, and thus an affirmation of her impeccable, if dubious, Orsini bloodline. And this was a thing. I'm showing you Bronzino's portrait of Ludovico Capponi in the Frick, who wears the black and white colors of the Capponi stemma, the Capponi coat of arms. The unicorn would carry a comparable symbolic significance, denoting Laura's Farnese descent, in addition to her virginal purity. Its meaning in Giulia Farnese's imagery is exactly this. And here I should say that although Laura's patronymic was Orsini, she was also referred to by contemporaries as Laura Farnese. And finally, if the scenario formulated for the lady with the unicorn is correct, its catalyst, like that of many female portraits of the time, must have been Laura Orsini's contractual betrothal and marriage in November 1505. At the time these negotiations were underway, she was 13 years old, an eminently plausible age for the sitter in Raphael's portrait. So I've laid out my case for who's represented here. Is there other evidence to support this identification, you might ask? And the answer is yes. The young woman's waist is cinched by a gold-clasp marriage belt or girdle, an item of bridal attire symbolizing marriage and fertility. So this portrait does indeed commemorate a betrothal or marriage and its aspirational hope for future children. The striking gold chain with an elaborate enameled and jeweled pendant suspended from the sitter's neck and her gold hair brooch also connote the ritual of marriage. Costly gems and ornaments like these signal the family's wealth and social standing, and they were conferred in connection with a betrothal. These form part of a woman's dowry and are frequently worn by their recipients in nuptial portraits, prompting one scholar to describe such bejeweled young women as, quote, dowry bedecked. Certain gems were expressly associated with marriage. Pearls were symbol of virginity and purity, rubies of prosperity and fertility, and sapphires of fidelity, making these jewels particularly suitable as wedding gifts. We know this was the case from many surviving documents concerning trousseaux and dowries, and portraits document this cultural practice. The lady with the unicorn, who's resplendent in her pearl, ruby, and sapphire pendant, falls into this category. What's more, the particular jewels represented here may well point expressly to Laura Orsini. A document of December 1505 concerning a debt she inherited from her mother, Giulia Farnese, itemizes jewels and other valuables that had been offered as collateral. Among them are a gold mesh chain and a clip or pendant with a diamond, a ruby, and hanging pearls. If Laura Orsini is the subject of Raphael's portrait, the prominent pearl and ruby pendant and the gold mesh chain worn by the sitter, and in the case of the chain, at least literally depicted here, this jewelry was in her family's possession. Inherited from her mother and grandmother, these pieces were part of Laura's dowry, as stipulated in the legal agreement concerning the nuptials. And although not one of a kind, we've seen already that similar jewels and gems appear in other portraits of the period. I think the prominence and the careful specificity of the jewelry seen here alert us that these items are not generic props, but rather real jewels belonging to the real person represented. Laura Orsini owned jewels exactly like these conspicuously displayed in this portrait: a large ruby, a hanging pearl, and a gold mesh necklace. You recall that I posited some connection with Urbino for the commission of this portrait, and in this context too, Laura Orsini is relevant given her betrothal and marriage at this very time it was painted to a Della Rovere, the designated successors to the childless Duke of Urbino. So they were the upcoming dukes, if you will, whose status and prestige its patriarch, the Pope, was determined to promote. The wedding celebration in Rome was a topic of conversation at the court of Urbino, as we know from a letter the Duchess received recounting amusing gossip about the festivities. One member of the Duchess of Urbino's circle was Julius's sister-in-law, Giovanna della Rovere, known as the Prefettessa, whom he described none too kindly as, quote, crazy and insolent. A champion of Raphael, she may have recommended him to her irascible brother-in-law, the Pope. Perhaps she even had a part in the commission of The Lady with the Unicorn. Regardless, a portrait of Laura Orsini would have been of interest to Julius, given his energetic solicitation of that particular Della Rovere bride. It's just possible, in fact, that the Pope himself requested the portrait, and perhaps directly from the artist, as he and a retinue of cardinals and courtiers passed through Urbino in September 1506. That papal stopover, I've wondered if it coincided with one of Raphael's own known visits to Urbino, and if it was the fateful prelude to his summons to Rome soon after. Time doesn't permit us to tug at that thread, but the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you.
So now you know what art historians have to do every time they're confronted by a portrait where we don't know who is being represented. As Professor Wolk-Simon has described, this really requires a lot of sleuthing and going in many different directions, as you have seen, not only historical, but also heraldry, also trying to understand the political networks and so much more. It is now my pleasure to introduce Caroline Elenowitz-Hess, who has been the brilliant and dedicated research associate supporting the exhibition Raphael Sublime Poetry on view at the Met. The Met's exhibition owes much to Caroline's insights, indefatigable energy, and superb organizational skills. She previously worked at the Met's American wing on the highly popular exhibition Sargent and Paris, which was on view at the Met and Musée d'Orsay in Paris in 2025. She specializes in late 19th and early 20th century art and design with a particular focus to the changing definitions of beauty and femininity. Caroline received her BA in English literature from Yale, an MA in fashion studies from Parsons, and is currently a PhD candidate in the Division of Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture at Bard Graduate Center. She has published articles in the Journal of Design History, Fashion Theory, and in the Catalogue for Sargent in Paris and Paris in 2025. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Elenowitz-Hess to the stage.
Thank you so much, Carmen, and thank you so much to our previous speakers. It's been such a pleasure to be part of this today. When Raphael died in 1520, he was considered the greatest artist of his generation. That fame and importance did not abate for centuries afterwards. He was famous throughout Europe, but in France in particular, Raphael became a model on which to base the idea of what French academic painting should be. Paintings by Raphael had already come to France during his lifetime, such as the Holy Family of Francis I, which Pope Leo X commissioned as a gift for his nephew to give the king. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Raphael was a model on which many French painters based themselves, such as Nicolas Poussin, who traveled to Rome to see his works in person and based a number of his own compositions on Raphael's, as the one here. Although the importance of certain artists grew and diminished in the eyes of the French Academy throughout the ensuing centuries, Raphael's star remained ascendant. And by the dawn of the 19th century, there was little debate amongst French artists that Raphael was one of the greatest painters of all time, and the one that French artists in particular should look to as an example of artistic perfection. This long-standing fame of Raphael took on a different character in the 19th century as France tried to redefine itself in the wake of the Revolution in this series of political regimes that followed the fall of the House of Bourbon. Here we have a painting by Hubert Robert that shows an idealized view of the Grande Galerie of the Louvre, which had already been used as an art gallery under Louis XVI, but under the New Republic would be able to be a public art gallery that was intended to educate the future artists of France. In the foreground, you can see a painting by Raphael, the Holy Family of Francis I, with an artist copying from the painting, as well as a woman looking over his shoulder, showing that art is important both for artists and as an educational and uplifting element in the new French society. The rise of Napoleon led to a new stage in France's relationship to Italian art. During Napoleon's successful military campaigns in Italy in the mid-1790s, the French government identified artworks they wanted to bring to French museums. The choice of works from Italy emphasized a link between Napoleonic France and the classical republics of Greece and Rome. This print shows a triumphant celebration of these treasures of Italy being marched into Paris. You can see in the center the sculpture of 4 bronze horses that were taken from St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. However, Napoleon didn't want only to remove these ancient Greek and Roman treasures. He was also interested in Renaissance art, and this vase made by the Sèvres factory shows another example of a propagandistic celebration of seized Italian art being brought into Paris. Amongst the examples of ancient sculpture, there is one identifiable painting, and if you look carefully, you can see it is Raphael's Transfiguration, which would come to be seen in 19th century France as the epitome of artistic achievement on the level of the ancient masters. Although the vase was ordered in 1810 by Napoleon, it wasn't actually completed until after Napoleon's fall from power, which meant it was difficult for the Sèvres factory to figure out what to do with a vase that celebrated the military victory of a deposed leader. However, it did end up being delivered to the new monarch, Louis XVIII, because the cultural import of these items was seen as significant enough they could still accept it into the royal collection as an important artistic milestone for France, not only Napoleon. This drawing shows the wedding of Napoleon to his second wife, Marie Louise of Austria, which was meant to establish him as a dynastic leader in France. If you look at the scene of marriage, it's a pageant about establishing the power of France, culturally and artistically. The wall of the Grande Galerie of the Louvre is full of paintings by Raphael, many of which they had taken from their homes in Italy, a show of both France's cultural superiority in highlighting an artist so universally admired, and France's military strength in having expropriated the works from their homeland. Here you can see the ones that are identifiable from this drawing. We have the Transfiguration at the center, the Ecstasy of St. Cecilia, which you can see exhibited upstairs, and the Madonna di Foligno. There's also a painting by Perugino. All of this would be a show of France's might and how Napoleon positioned the French Empire as the heir to the Italian Renaissance. Although the paintings themselves were returned to their countries of origin after an 1815 treaty, Raphael's importance for France and French artists was already established. Although Raphael had long been seen as a model on whom to base composition and painting technique, in the early 19th century, artists began to include Raphael himself in history paintings. This painting was exhibited in the Salon of 1806 and shows the scene of Raphael on his deathbed. The composition focuses on Pope Leo X's gesture of blessing over the body of the artist, a significant honor that emphasizes the ideal relationship between artist and patron. If you look behind his bed, you can see a glimpse of Transfiguration, a work that was known to have been positioned there at Raphael's death and would have been particularly unmistakable to the French audiences because it had only recently been brought to Paris. The composition draws a visual link between the luminous body of the deceased artist and the scene of Christ, lit from within with divine essence. Underscoring how well this work served the aesthetic priorities of the Napoleonic regime, it was acquired by Napoleon's first wife, Empress Josephine, for Malmaison. These three paintings are examples from throughout the 19th century of how Raphael became a common subject for French art, especially works shown at the annual state-sponsored art exhibition called the Salon. Moreover, they show that they're more interested in Raphael as a historic character, as they do not necessarily embrace his painting technique or manner of stylistic expression. The painting on the far left, although identified by its title as a scene of Raphael, does not match any known Madonna and child image. Instead, it animates the exchange between Raphael and his anonymous female model, suggesting the creative process fueled by the model herself. One important thing to note about these three paintings is that they were all acquired by the French state and are in the Louvre's collection today, an example of the continued sponsorship by the state of the idea and the ideal of Raphael. The central painting is the most well-known of this trio and actually shows a dramatized scene of Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo. Raphael is at the center, surrounded by workshop assistants. Leonardo is at upper right, and Michelangelo at lower left, looking particularly aggravated. The placement of the peasant, woman, and child at the center of the painting implies the naturalism of Raphael's Madonna and child images was due to inspiration from real-life scenarios he witnessed in Rome, an element of 19th century painting in particular. The artist who most consistently engaged with the legacy of Raphael in the first half of the 19th century was Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. He studied under Jacques-Louis David, who was on the Revolutionary Committee of the Arts and Sciences, who staged the scene of bringing the arts of Italy into Paris. The painting at the center here is Ingres' Raphael and the Fornarina, which shows a scene of Raphael with his model and mistress, Margherita Luti, who Raphael painted in the guise of Venus in the Fornarina at right, and which is on display upstairs. She became a figure of particular importance in the 19th century imagination, the model counterpart to Raphael, who was the model artist. In this painting, which is the first of 5 versions of the subject that he paints, you can see the Fornarina sits on the lap of Raphael as he gazes at the painting of her. And this has been interpreted as Raphael turning towards his art and away from the woman herself, choosing art over human attachments. In the background is his painting, the Madonna della Seggiola, which is another Raphael Madonna that had been taken from Italy to France by Napoleon, and one that particularly captured the imagination of French artists. Here are 3 more versions of the scene, as Ingres seemed preoccupied with exploring the relationship between the artist and his model. Note how in each version, the Fornarina is more and more undressed and more enveloping of Raphael until she resembles the Madonna della Seggiola enveloping the Christ child more than the figure in Raphael's painting of La Fornarina. Ingres actually planned to do an entire series on the life of Raphael, but only the painting of Raphael and the Fornarina and the second painting here showing his betrothal to a niece of Cardinal Bibbiena were completed. Ingres, though, was not only inspired by the life of Raphael, he felt that the art of Raphael should be his guide and talked about how Raphael was the yardstick against which he measured his own art. He was not shy in making known his love of Raphael, and this central painting, which shows Louis XIII making a vow to the Virgin Mary, was meant to recall Raphael's paintings, both the Sistine Madonna and the Madonna di Foligno, which you can see on either side here. Many more Ingres paintings overtly reference Raphael works, such as this Madonna, which so closely resembles the Madonna of the Candelabra. Another version of this Ingres composition is also on view in the European Paintings Galleries at the Met, so I challenge you to go find it. Ingres' appreciation of Raphael reached beyond that of an artistic hero, closer to the level of a saint. In fact, when Raphael's tomb was opened in 1833, Ingres asked someone present to bring him a piece of Raphael's bones, fragments of which are preserved today at the Ingres Museum in Montauban as if they were religious relics. The pseudo-canonization of Raphael was complete when images of the artist were included in murals decorating the most important buildings in Paris for art. The first was the Louvre, where Horace Vernet painted a scene of Pope Julius II with Raphael, Bramante, and Michelangelo in 1827. This was further reinforced in 1850, which is shown here, when Charles-Louis Muller painted a second scene tying Raphael to the artistic history of France, showing the presentation of Raphael's painting, St. Michael Vanquishing Satan, to King Francis I. The second important building that included an image of Raphael was the École des Beaux-Arts, the most important art school in Paris with origins in the 17th century. Significantly, it was the training ground for the standard bearers of the tradition of academic art, a practice built on following the example of Raphael. From 1841 to 1842, Paul Delaroche created the Hémicycle des Beaux-Arts, which featured the painters, sculptors, architects, and engravers that Delaroche and his contemporaries considered to be the greatest in history. The painting itself, which still decorates the school's auditorium, probably also dominates it, is a double evocation of Raphael, as he appears as a key figure on the right side of the composition. He's right here. But the entire scene is also a conscious imitation of Raphael's Vatican frescoes, specifically the Disputa. The peaks that Raphael reached in the French cultural imagination meant that artists that wanted to break away from tradition, and specifically the tradition of the French Academy, deliberately rejected Raphael as their model. Outside France, artistic movements had formed that deliberately distanced themselves from Raphael. First, the German Nazarene movement, and then the British Pre-Raphaelites. In France, artists who embraced realism, such as Courbet, were turning away from Raphael's celebrated harmony and decorum. For the Impressionists working in the 1850s and 60s, the desire for aesthetic independence and a modern style could mean a disavowal of the artist to whom the entire French artistic establishment continually turned. However, this binary division between adoration and rejection of Raphael is not true to the actual artistic context of the Impressionists in Paris. I will focus on Edgar Degas and Edouard Manet to explore how Raphael's foundational role in French 19th century art extended beyond those now understood as academic painters. Degas is an example of an artist who spent a significant amount of time learning from Raphael and his works in the Louvre. A number of studies that Degas did from Raphael works survive, including this sketch after a work that was at the time understood to be a self-portrait of Raphael, which we now believe should be attributed to Parmigianino. However, a comparison between Degas' drawing and the painting showed he put great care in observing it carefully. Even more interesting is the fact that if you flip the sheet over, it shows Degas' own self-portrait sketch, and one can imagine the 20-year-old artist measuring himself against Raphael. This is not the only example of Degas representing himself in the tradition of Raphael. Some scholars have drawn a parallel between this self-portrait from the Clark Art Institute and Raphael's self-portrait from the Uffizi. There are not quite enough distinguishing features here to say that Degas was undoubtedly imitating this Raphael self-portrait directly, but Raphael's was an example that generations of artists would have seen and perhaps even unconsciously copied. However, in Degas' double portrait of himself with his friend Évariste de Verlaine, he was deliberately restaging a Raphael double portrait he would have seen at the Louvre, which shows Raphael with a friend, possibly Giulio Romano. Although the two paintings are mirror images, in both it is the artist who looks out at the viewer and the friend who looks away, and both figures have parallel body positions. There are more examples of Impressionists and other artists who rejected the academic system responding to Raphael, but the final work I want to focus on today is Edouard Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, known at the time as Le Bain, or The Bath. It was painted in 1862 and exhibited in the 1863 Salon des Refusés after being rejected by the jury of the state-sponsored salon. It was considered incredibly shocking when first exhibited, and even today, the juxtaposition of the nude female figure seated outside with the dressed men is unusual and arresting. Although the work was not universally rejected, critics at the time found the composition disturbing and incongruous, and the painting style unrefined. However, they did not identify that this unconventional painting rose out of a very conventional technique of reusing the composition of a revered master artist. Only in 1908, decades after Raphael's death, did a German scholar named Gustav Pauli link the painting to its source, The Judgment of Paris by Marcantonio Raimondi, an engraving based on a lost painting by Raphael. Raphael's own composition was based on 2 2nd-century Roman sarcophagi, so the tradition of artists copying artists continues. The 3 river gods on the right side of the engraving are the model for the body positions of the 3 central figures of Déjeuner-sur-l'Herbe. Although the male river god from the left side of the grouping has been transformed here into a female model, note how many pieces are identical. The most obvious element that connects the 2 scenes is the unusual positioning of their legs and their parallel arm gestures. But there are other details that match too. Look at the fabric that's wrapped around the model's foot in the Manet painting. It's exactly the same as the drapery encircling the foot of the river god. The piece of vegetation in the right river god's left hand has been transformed into a walking stick in Manet's rendition. The comparison between the 2 raises another interesting inversion of expectation. Though it may seem like the nude figure at the center of the painting is shocking, she's actually the most traditional, and the dressed men are the ones who are out of place. As in his painting Olympia, which used the same model, Victorine Meurent, and he had exhibited in the Salon the year before, the nude model is part of a conversation with artistic tradition that was disturbing to its 19th century viewers by dint of its modern yet ambiguous context. But what was Manet trying to convey by relying on a Raphael composition that contemporary reviewers were unable to identify and that Manet never publicly pointed out to them? Several scholars have offered readings of this painting as an allegory for painting itself, emphasizing that the setting of a nude woman among dressed men was a common sight in the artist's studio. This brings us back to Raphael, though, and the fascination amongst 19th century artists with portraying his relationship with the foreign arena, best known from her semi-nude portrait in The Guise of Venus. Can we draw a line between Ingres's repetitive restaging of Raphael with his mistress in paintings in which she becomes more and more undressed, with Manet's Raphael-esque staging of a nude female model amongst male figures based on Manet's family members? Is Manet thumbing his nose at traditionalists by following the model of the greatest example of artistic achievement in a work evidently meant to upend convention? Whatever Manet's ultimate message, his work makes clear how embedded Raphael's work was in the consciousness of 19th century artists, whether traditionalists or members of the avant-garde. From the early 19th century, when Napoleon used Raphael's works to prove France's military might, he took on a unique role at the apex of artistic achievement and popularity, such that artists of middling skill could hope to enter the collection of the French state by portraying Raphael as the imprimatur of his importance elevated their work. Ingres's love of Raphael and his importance as an artist went hand in hand. It's difficult to imagine an artist from the second half of the 19th century responding to Raphael without being conscious of the influence of Ingres as an icon of the French Academy in the decades before. And even if you're trying to move away from the influence of the Academy, there's no getting away from Raphael. Raphael was so entwined with the idea of what an artist was, it was impossible not to engage with his work on some level. And that doesn't stop in the 19th century. As artists working in France, Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, Salvador Dali, all found themselves grappling with Raphael's legacy, and I'm grateful for Arnold for showing that painting earlier. We were very much in sync. When we go into Raphael's Sublime Poetry and stand surrounded by Raphael's work, perhaps we ourselves can understand a bit of why they've had such a long-term impact. Thank you.
an absolutely brilliant paper. Thank you, Caroline. So with this lecture, we conclude our Sunday at the Met event dedicated to Raphael. And please join me in thanking Mariana Siciliano and her team in education. And another ovation of thanks to our colleagues in the Grace Rainey Auditorium who have worked tirelessly all on this event. A round of applause also to you, our faithful audience, for your great support of our programs and exhibitions. I invite you to go see the exhibition Raphael Sublime Poetry in the upstairs galleries at the Met. Remember, the museum closes at 5 p.m. Thank you for coming.